What's up everyone? Hello and welcome to the third video on the second chapter. Today I'm going to talk about adaptation. Last time I finished with the idea of monstration based on André Gaudreau's theoretical input, which was about the lamination or the combination of the mimetic and the diegetic part of filmic narration. Now I'm going on and we'll try to talk about how literature as a verbal medium gets into an audiovisual medium, so how what it lacks, that is the image, becomes an important aspect of film narratives where we lack the textual elements. So let's see how this uneasy friendship or relationship becomes one of the most inspiring part of the history of cinema. Adaptation is basically as old as cinema. The very first films were more or less after the Lumiere brothers. They were adaptations. The reason is very simple. First of all, literature provides ample stories for filmmakers. That it's really easy to pick up a story and to develop it as a film. The other interesting fact about adaptation is that it was thought that if films use literary, especially classical literature sources, then film as a new medium, which was believed to be a cheap entertainment, can prove that it's an art, it's a form of art. And if so, then movie theaters can become venues of taste, just like theater in the good old times. So there is a cultural and there is an economic factor in using literary sources and working on adaptations at the very early stage of cinema as well. So it basically helped to establish a social and cultural status for cinema. Interestingly, serious academic interest surged only in the 1960s and 70s, precisely because before that, as I explained in the last video, there was no film studies involved in academic inquiries. Metz started to establish it, surprisingly again, comparing it to language and comparing to how we use language. So basically it was an easy bridge for mainly literary scholars working in literary departments to use what they had as their resource, in other words, literary theory and literary terminology, and study something else, not literature this time, but films. Now, how do you do that? How do you explain that suddenly you're interested in films in the academia? Well, of course, adaptation comes to the rescue, saying that I want to study how this piece of literature is translated into this piece of film. Adaptation is interesting and it's a powerful tool. It can build and forge national identities, as you could see with the British movies from the 1980s on, which helped to redefine Britishness for foreign audiences and also for themselves partly. It can build up completely new stars. In other words, it's capable of establishing celebrity status. Think of Colin Firth when he first appeared in the BBC adaptation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Then a novel came out, Bridget Jones's Diary, in which there was a Mr. Darcy, obviously as a reference to Austen's novel, but also, let's be frank, the Mr. Darcy that appeared in Helen Fielding's book is basically the film adaptation, the television adaptation of the BBC. That is Mr. Darcy as appearing in Bridget Jones's novel, in Bridget Jones's story, is basically Colin Firth. So evidently, we come to the film adaptation of Helen Fielding's book, Bridget Jones's Diary, in which Mr. Darcy is played by the same Colin Firth who played Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice. And then, obviously, he had a hard time getting rid of that stereotypical role, but that's another question. So that's what basically adaptation can do for you. You can have many other examples, of course, from the history of film. Now, interestingly, even today, it seems that the most prevalent and the main approach in criticism concerning adaptation is what we call fidelity criticism. Now, what fidelity criticism means is studying how the adaptation, the film text, is faithful, to what degree it is faithful to the original text. There are two trends within fidelity criticism that we need to study. First, we have fidelity to the letter, which examines word by word whether the words of the narrator or the author are translated into the film, whether they make it into the film. And then we have fidelity to the spirit of the work, which supposes that there is a central message, there is a spirit to the original literary work, which needs to be translated or taken over by the film adaptation. The basis for this kind of thinking is that literature is always of a higher status. Literature is something like an established art, and film therefore can only gain a lower status. It's not that important, it's not that artistic, it's a cheap, subordinate copy, basically. It cannot do what literature is capable of doing. Now, many problems arise with these approaches. First of all, how can you faithfully transform words into shots? If you remember Christian Metz's example, then you know that it's basically impossible to find a relation between them. So that's there a problem. Another problem that arises is, what does it mean that a novel has a spirit? Is it meaning? Is it some internal message waiting to be decoded? Or what is it exactly? So what do we expect filmmakers to convey in the film adaptation? That, again, is already problematic. We learn from post-structuralists that basically meaning, any meaning, arises within the encounter of the reader with the text, or the viewer and the filmic text, if you want. So based on this faulty and questionable critical approach, a categorization of fidelity started to take on, and several critics started to create a hierarchy within adaptation, within the study of adaptation, to argue for the levels of fidelity. Dudley Andrew, for example, he created a tripartite, so a three-level structure, hierarchy, in which might give you some grasp on how to approach fidelity studies. This is borrowing. Number one is borrowing, whereby an idea of a literary text is borrowed basically by the filmmaker and developed and enlarged upon. Here you may not suspect that there is a literary source, because it's not explicitly stated. For example, Amy Heckerling's Clueless in the 90s. Not many critics realized that it was basically an adaptation of, again, Jane Austen's Emma. It was, but it was only the idea, the basic idea of the story that was taken over, and then it was basically an adaptation, an updated adaptation of that very idea. So that's borrowing. In the middle, you will find intersecting, what Dudley Andrew calls intersecting, in which the adaptation preserves the uniqueness of the original text. That's an academic definition for intersection. Now, what do we mean by the uniqueness? How do you identify the uniqueness of a literary text, and how do you measure that in terms of the film adaptation? Now, one example might come to mind, and that's Robert Bresson's Diary of a County Priest, where you basically have a priest who is writing a journal, and then events unfold as journal entries. Now, what you can see in the adaptation is basically this. You will find the priest who is writing a diary, and basically you will see the events unfold on the page or from the pages, visually speaking, of the diary. We dive into the diary, and that's how the narrative will appear in front of your eyes. So that might be considered as a kind of a preservation of the uniqueness of the original text, but it won't really get you far as understanding what's going on. And the last third cluster in this categorization or in this typology of Dudley Andrews is fidelity and transformation. Here it is required that the film adaptation reproduce something essential of the text, be it the words themselves or the aforementioned spirit of the work. Now, this approach only creates a system of hierarchy based on the distance between film adaptation and novel, but it definitely does not help a fully critical attitude to develop. Only, interestingly, it was in the 1990s, that a new critical tendency came to the scene with the adaptation of the very old term dialogism. Now, the origin of the term goes back to Mikhail Bakhtin, a Russian-Soviet critic, who argued that each and every utterance will always be in relationship with each and every other utterances possible. Now, it might be a sentential and very interesting argument, but if you think about it, and again we jump back to the 60s, and you remember Yulia Kristeva's term of intertextuality, that's it. Basically, we can argue that Bakhtin paved the way for the introduction and critical acceptance of the term intertextuality. Now, in the 90s, a Bakhtin scholar in New York, Robert Stam, imports the original term, the Bakhtinian term, and combines it with Kristeva's insights in terms of intertextuality, and coins the term intertextual dialogism, which marks a new wave in the study of adaptation. In this, he explains that there's no hierarchy between the literary and the filmic text. There's no sense in talking about origin, source, or any kind of chronological discrepancies, because the viewer, what he or she gets is basically either the text or the adaptation. There's no sense in differentiating in perception. He also argues that there basically is no critical gain in comparing and contrasting the film and the literary text, because okay, we can have a list of the comparative analysis, but it doesn't explain anything about how that adaptation works. So what he offers instead is an intertextual and intermedial approach, where you take into consideration in your critical analysis the literary part, that is literary history, what that text does, I mean the original text, the adapted text, how it works, how it functions, what kind of narrative it posits, how it is built up in terms of narrative structure, what are the characters like, blah, 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 blah. And then also you need to take into consideration the filmic equivalent of this process. In other words, you have to tackle the issue of the film's position within film history, how it works as a genre film, for example, and how that relates to the literary text. So there's a dialogism, there's basically a dialogue going on between the media. In other words, it's not only intertextual, the approach itself is not only intertextual, but also intermedial, which adds another layer to the critical analysis. A good example to illustrate this approach might be the film called Adaptation, 2002, Spike Jonze and Charlie Kaufman film. They did this film after Being John Malkovich, if you know that film, and it helps you position in film history. Now, it is a very interesting and intriguing project. The film itself was written by, the script was written by Charlie Kaufman, who was given a book Susan Orlean's The Orchid Thief to adapt. And he decided that he wants to skip the Hollywood narrative cliches, and he wants to do justice to the book, and he wants to do an adaptation of the book as presenting flowers. It's about flowers, orchids. So let's do a film about orchids. That was the original position. And then he soon realizes that this book cannot be adapted. It's impossible to adapt. He starts to struggle with that, and he fails and he fails and he fails. And what he figures out is, why not make a film about how it is impossible to adapt Susan Orlean's book? And so the film called Adaptation becomes a film about the impossibility to adapt a book, which serves as a basis for the film Adaptation. So it's a very, very intriguing trick of adaptation. But what it illustrates really well is how the layers of talking and working with narrations come together in forming a completely new piece of work that might not be related to the literary source in the way we thought it was related. In other words, let's skip this very old and strange word of fidelity, because it doesn't give us anything. It won't lead to a solution when talking about adaptation. Instead, let's embrace the complexity of discourses inherent in film and in literature, and let's see how these two traditions come up with the adaptation. I will return soon with the third chapter on psychoanalysis. Until then, dream on and stay safe and healthy.